Falling in D&D is one of those things that works okay enough, but has always felt a little off. Currently, falling is just a pop quiz that asks, do you have feather fall, yes or no? As a player, the rules of falling make it very difficult to actually use it against your enemies. It's almost impossible sometimes to chain multiple knockback effects together to launch creatures high up. And there aren't any rules for doing cool things with it, like using it to make your melee attack stronger. After this video, you'll walk away with an understanding of why the falling rules are the way that they are, how gravity works IRL, and how we can merge the two into a more comprehensive set of rules that are easy to use at the table and feel more like falling does in the real world. When you fall in D&D, you take 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 10 feet you fall, up to a maximum of 20d6, and you always fall prone unless you're a monk or something and avoid taking fall damage. If you're falling into a liquid, you can make a check to halve the damage. The first issue I have with these rules is there's no explicit clarification on when falling takes place or how fast a creature falls. The rules as written answer is you fall immediately and the entire distance instantly. The answer I feel is more relevant is that they put the when and how fast into the let the DM handle it area and just said how much damage it does because that is probably the first question someone's going to have. These rules work, but feel off if you play a character that knocks people around a lot, like I did recently with my Path of the Goliath Barbarian. It can feel strange at times to essentially have an enemy oscillating between being in the air and on the ground multiple times in a turn without having any actual airtime. The rules are this way for a reason though. Falling is built into the game as a hazard, not as a state for some creature to exist in. Hazards are meant to be resolved swiftly and easily. Right now, it's easy for anyone to use as long as they can divide by 10, and when we're refining the rules later on and changing it into a state, we're going to want to maintain that property. First, let's go ahead and take a look at the differences between falling in D&D and Gravity on Earth to see why it feels a little off to just instantly fall. Falling in D&D and Gravity on Earth differ in two main ways. First, gravity causes creatures to accelerate, getting faster and faster as they fall, whereas in D&D, they fall straight to the ground instantly. Acceleration due to gravity on Earth is 9.8 meters per second squared, but because D&D uses the Imperial system, we'll be converting some things over to feet per second or feet per second squared when we need to. So using the distance formula, we can calculate how far something falls in 6-second intervals and use that as a reference for what we're going to do later. The distance formula is d equals vt plus 1/2 at squared, where d is distance, v is the initial velocity, a is acceleration, and t is time. We're going to assume our initial velocity is always 0, because it covers most situations where something is knocked into the air and then begins falling, because even if just for a very, very small amount of time, that thing as it goes from an upward velocity to a downward velocity has a velocity of 0. Because we're assuming v to be 0, we can just ignore the vt term in our equation. A, in our case, is negative 32.2, which is 9.8 meters converted to feet. A is negative because the subject is falling, therefore its position is decreasing. We can plug 0, 6, and 12 into the formula to see how much distance something falls after those amount of seconds. At 0 seconds, the subject has fallen 0 feet. At 6 seconds, it has fallen 579.6 feet, and at 12 seconds, it has fallen 2,318.4 feet. The subject falls more and more within the 6-second interval because its speed is increasing. That's what acceleration means. These numbers do not represent a creature free-falling on Earth exactly, because we are ignoring air resistance. But that's complicated, and I'm not entirely confident I could do those calculations without messing something up, so I'm going to leave it alone for now. What I will talk about in reference to air resistance is terminal velocity, or the speed at which the resistance of the medium, in this case air, is enough to prevent further acceleration. Terminal velocity of a human is about 120 miles per hour, or 176 feet per second. It takes about 10 to 12 seconds to get close enough to terminal velocity to where any further acceleration is negligible, and 10 to 12 seconds means we can just use 2 rounds. So knowing that our terminal velocity is 176 feet per second and around 6 seconds, that after accelerating for 2 rounds, we travel at 1,056 feet per round, which I am more than happy just to round down to 1,000 when we make our rules. But what about the first 2 rounds? Well, I'm not actually that concerned with being super physically accurate. I just want it feeling good enough and being easy to calculate. So we can pick 2 numbers that are easy to work with, so long as they generally follow an acceleration curve. I think 250 feet for the first round, 500 for the second, and 1,000 for the rest works well in maintaining the calculatory ease of falling while also making it a bit more accurate and feel more like it should. I also like the idea of making it so falling speed replaces the creature's movement for the turn, so that players get to decide when their actions take place, whether it be before, during, or after their fall. But this is very much a rule of cool approach, so you may make it at the end of their current turn if you prefer something a little bit more realistic. The second thing to change about falling is that falling doesn't affect all creatures the same way. I mean, think about it. you can fall just a few feet, maybe half your height, and bruise yourself pretty easily. But a bug can fall from your ceiling and land just fine, even though it fell many times its height. This is due to something called the square cube law. The square cube law is pretty simple. As some three-dimensional shape increases in size, its volume increases faster than its surface area. For example, if we have a cube, the volume is the result of the edge length cubed, whereas the surface area is 6 times the edge length squared. For a little while, the surface area is in fact greater, but the volume very quickly takes off faster than the surface area does. So when a larger creature hits the ground, there is more volume on a proportionally smaller surface area, which results in more pressure and, for us, more damage. There is a fairly famous quote by 20th century scientist J.B.S. Haldane that illustrates this point by saying, "To the mouse and any smaller animal, gravity presents practically no dangers. You can drop a mouse down a 1,000-yard mine shaft, and on arriving at the bottom, it gets a slight shock and walks away. A rat is killed, a man is broken, and a horse splashes." Now, we're playing a fantasy game, so I don't necessarily want to apply the square cube law completely realistically. Otherwise, most gargantuan creatures wouldn't be able to support their own body weight, so let's do something different instead. For every 10 feet a creature falls, it takes bludgeoning damage equal to 1 roll of its falling die. For small creatures, this is 1d4, medium is 1d6, and so on and so forth until we get to gargantuan being 1d12. Tiny creatures don't take fall damage, so druids, go ahead, turn into a frog, and jump off that mountain. But if you don't like the idea of being able to negate fall damage in this way, you can make them take 1 fall damage instead. Lastly, let's talk about improving the way creatures, but more specifically players, interact with falling. I think it would be fun to try to air assassinate someone like I'm playing Dishonored, or at the very least, use an enemy to break my fall a little bit. I think being able to do things like that, or use teamwork and try to catch my falling allies, or dive through the air to fall faster would be far more engaging than what we have now. But I'm not going to spout rules at you for another minute and a half, so instead I compiled all the falling rules from this video in a document that is linked in the description down below. This also includes some variants and other things like that in case you aren't exactly satisfied with what I presented here today. This format is pretty similar to D&D with a twist if you're familiar with the Pointy Hat channel, but it has more of a mechanical focus and with a bit of math slipped in, but I'm still going to give credit where credit's due. I'm not sure if I'll revisit this format again, but I might, just because of how much I like homebrewing new systems and rules, and exploring some real-life inspirations for making them feel right. The point of this is not physical accuracy necessarily. The point of this is to make things feel right by emulating how they work into the real world just enough. If you enjoyed the video, learned something, or liked the rules I came up with, I would appreciate if you left a like on the video and subscribed. But most importantly, thank you for watching, and have a good one.